My name is Nandita Bajaj, and I teach a graduate course at Antioch University through the Institute for Humane Education. And the course that I teach is the one I actually developed through my master's degree in humane education. And it's called Pronatalism, Overpopulation, and the Planet: The Personal, Cultural, and Global Implications of Having a Child. So pronatalism is the institutional and social pressures that are placed on people, primarily women, to have children, to grow institutional power. Confronting pronatalism is not an attack on parenthood. Rather, it's confronting the ideology that removes the autonomy from people to decide whether or not they should have kids, and if so, how many children and when. Pronatalism as an ideology was institutionalized a long time ago, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, when empires and states were starting to be created and the elites were looking to grow the strength of their states. And that is when we believe even the gender division of labor really started to exist, where women were pushed into the home sphere in order to have as many children as possible to grow the state, and men were pushed into becoming warriors to protect the state. Thousands of years of that type of kind of institutionalized patriarchy has led to a lot of other different institutional pressures on people to have children. Of those, we see religion as being a huge one. It shows up in the form of corporate or economic pressures in order to grow the economy, in order to have more consumers. It also continues to show up through political pressures in order to have a stronger military, a stronger taxpayer base, or could be driven by ethnocentrism or nationalism. The reason pronatalism is so harmful is because procreating or having children is a very important and consequential life decision for the parent, for the child, and for the planet. That's one of the first things we look at in the course, is how pronatalism harms the reproductive autonomy of women, how it harms men through the pressures it places on them, and also how pronatalism harms children. And we also look at policies, legal policies, government policies, and how they incentivize reproduction and disincentivize people who do not choose the dominant pathway. For example, people who are single, who are child-free, who are childless, who do not fit the more heteronormative nuclear family definition. And then we move into the second part of the course, where we look at how pronatalism fuels population growth, how that perpetuates the exploitation of nature and the non-human world, and how they are all deeply interconnected. Human beings have been around for 300,000 years, and that for most of our human history, 99.9% of it, our population stayed below 1 million globally. And then it took us 300,000 years to get to 1 billion, so 3 extra zeros, 1 billion. That happened in 1800. And then because of the Industrial Revolution, because of access to cheap fossil fuel energy, both our population and our consumption exploded in just the last 200 years, from 1 billion to 8 billion. That is completely unprecedented. Most ecologists and scientists call the last 200 years of our human history an anomaly. It's completely abnormal as far as any species is concerned. And as a result of our growth, we've literally obliterated most of the other non-human world and created a lot of the ecological catastrophes that we're experiencing today. The last few decades, talking about population and even the word overpopulation has become a taboo subject. So we spend a lot of time unpacking why it has become a taboo subject. When scientists and development experts really started talking about population concerns about 50, 60, 70 years ago, there were a lot of great policies that were put into place to help people confront patriarchal norms and have access to education, family planning counseling, contraceptives that helped people, especially women, realize their reproductive desires. And fertility rates around the world dropped significantly because of greater access and equality. However, there were a few policies that were put into place from using coercive authoritarian measures, such as China's one-child policy, such as the forced sterilization campaign in India and Puerto Rico. And then we had a few eugenics-based policies, both in Europe and in the US, that really impacted and exploited the rights of the most marginalized communities. And unfortunately, even though those types of policies were the exceptions and not the rule, a lot of people became very concerned that talking about population somehow always leads to coercion and exploitation of reproductive rights. So, we unpack those policies and we talk about why it is always necessary to remain suspicious of any type of top-down policies that are based on control rather than autonomy. Being able to unpack pronatalism for so many of them is just revelatory. It's the first time that anyone's had a conversation with them about this most personal decision of whether or not to have children, and if so, when, and how do you make the decision about having children? What are some of the competencies you have to keep in mind? What are some things you can expect? After you become a parent, obviously the joys of parenthood, which, I think we see many examples of that in culture, but often the things don't get talked about that students appreciate the most is the ambivalence parents feel after becoming parents, of the loss of identity, of the pre-parenthood identity, how it changes their relationship dynamic, how sometimes there is regret involved, and how do you navigate being a responsible parent while not letting that regret affect the child's well-being. And then for a lot of younger people, they are questioning more and more some of these dominant narratives. And yet they live within a pronatalist landscape that tells them that parenthood is their destiny. So when they're trying to weigh the decision of whether or not to bring a child into this world against their own expectation to have a child, it can be very confusing. It can feel like, you're being torn. And the most recurring comment that I hear from students is that it's been so empowering for them to go into this world knowing deep within themselves that they've explored this possibility, they know the full spectrum of what to expect, and that they can now go and explore for themselves whether this is the right decision. On a planet facing so many crises, we do know from studies that children born today and in the future will experience more dire circumstances, 2 to 7 times more dire circumstances than previous generations have. So I think that is a component that needs to be kept in mind. And a lot of people appreciate that obligation piece, that it's not just about parent-centered decision-making, it's also taking into account the rights and well-being of the potential child. But then, of course, the global part in my course, the global implications is Well, what impact does putting more people on the planet has on the non-human world, who all these individuals and populations who have every bit as right to exist and thrive with dignity within their own non-human cultures as we do. And what has population growth over the last couple of hundred years done in terms of decimating the non-human world, their habitats, their families? Um, and then, of course, how has it contributed to the climate crisis, the species extinction crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the ocean acidification, the pollution? We talk about how population exacerbates everything else that's negative. So the way I came to develop this course is based so much on my own personal journey and my own personal revelations that I've had over the last 20 or so years. And the story starts with, I was raised in India until I was 17, and then my parents and I moved to Canada with my sister. Moving from a country that is now the most populous country in the world, to me, it was a visceral reality that overpopulation was an issue. I saw it around me in all sorts of ways, whether it was, the devaluing of human life, non-human animal life, the devaluing of nature, the resource scarcity, etc. That component of population was very much part of who I am. And then during my 10, 15 years of being in Canada, I saw myself as a relatively non-traditional person. My parents raised me with, really liberal, progressive values and gave me the autonomy to do whatever I wanted to do. However, it wasn't until my late 20s when I met my partner, my now husband, that we started talking about the decision to have children. And until that discussion, I had no idea that it was a decision. I had just taken that to be an inevitability, that this is something that I would do. Of course, we would have children. And to me, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized that it was actually a decision we could make. And we chose to not have children, but I became really interested. And so that became the second seed of exploring, well, this is interesting. If many people are having children because they're expected to and didn't even know they had a choice, how does that tie to population? And the fact that I come from the most populous country in the world, and it happens to be a patriarchal, traditional country where, gendered roles are extremely rigid, maybe there's a connection there between pronatalism and population. It was around that time that I found the Institute for Humane Education as well. So I was already kind of making these connections between pronatalism, population growth, animal exploitation, nature exploitation. And when I first started to take the course, the Introduction to Humane Education, I inquired about, making these connections, and every single instructor that I had encouraged me and really nourished my curiosity around these connections. And from the very beginning, I was encouraged to start thinking in a big way about, how can I bring these connections into life? Just as it happens, through IHE, as I was designing this course, I also wanted to gain some field experience in this area. And I took a role as an intern at this organization called Population Balance. And I interned with them for a number of months, after which a position opened up in the organization where the current executive director who was mentoring me decided to retire. And I applied for the position, which I ended up getting. And so now I'm the executive director of Population Balance for the last 3 years. And one of the first things I did when I took over the leadership position was I transformed the entire organization's vision to integrate humane education principles. One of the most important lessons that I learned, having spent so many years both learning from and now teaching in the field of humane education, is in the midst of all of these crises, we become the pillar of obligation. Even if hope is difficult to grasp, it can be seen as an obligation that we have toward the planet and all the incredible beings on the planet to do whatever we can, not necessarily to create a utopian future, if that seems like a really, far-fetched vision, but to minimize suffering. Every little thing that we do can lead to less suffering, which means more good. And so I think looking at it in the form of a spectrum of change rather than it's either going to change the world or it's going to be meaningless, it's really important to look at it that way of incremental change. And I feel that education can play a big role, especially when done strategically by educating leaders. Courses offered through the Institute actually attract people that are already leading either nonprofits or are working in educational institutions that have that multiplier effect of change. So I do feel that education, when done strategically, can have a ripple effect in creating policy change and system change that we're all after.